and welcome to the Grand Valley campus for what we believe will be an evening that is informative and interesting for all of you. My name is Keith Behrens, and on behalf of the Collegiate Bible Study Group, which is sponsoring tonight's event, we'd like to welcome you to the debate on creation versus evolution. There are those who debate such problems as to whether something tastes great or is less filling, but we are considering a topic which has far greater implications, and that is one that will give us a clue to the understanding where we have come from. And so at this time, I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, Mr. Michael Kaufman, who is a professor of speech at the Grand Rapids Baptist College.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you for coming tonight. Our two debaters will be debating the question, does the scientific evidence support the theory of evolution or the theory of special creation as an answer to the development of life? If you've had a chance to look over your program, you've become well aware of the qualifications of our two debaters. I will not go through those, but I will just direct your attention to some basic information. Dr. Gish-Weinshank comes from Michigan State University, where he is a professor of computer science and natural science. Let's give him a round of applause, please. His opponent in the debate tonight is Dr. Dwayne Gish from the Institute of Creation Research. Again, as you look over the program, you can become appraised of his credentials. Let's give Dr. Gish a round of applause, too. We thank you two gentlemen for taking times out of your busy schedules to be with us tonight. Let me share a few words with you about the format of our debate. You can see the question in your program to be debated, and as you notice, each of our participants will have an opportunity of up to 60 minutes to share an opening statement, a positive statement with regard to their position regarding the question. The order of that of the participants will be switched. Dr. Gish will go first, and Dr. Weinshank will follow. And each participant will have up to 60 minutes to share their perspective of the question. We will then have a 10-minute intermission period where you'll be free to get up out of your chair and leave. It could very well be that you'll have a question that you'd like to have answered, a question that you would like the two participants to answer. If that's the case, there are ushers at the doors who will take your question on your way out, and then I will have a chance to look those over and select some representative questions for our participants to answer during the final round, the questions from the audience period following the rebuttals. Notice that there will be a 10-minute intermission followed by 15-minute rebuttals, by 5-minute rebuttals, then a 5-minute statement by each participant on religious implications of the question. There will then be another 10-minute intermission, and at that point the formal debate session will be over. I want to make you aware, though, that each participant will then stay, and there will be an opportunity on an informal basis for you to ask questions if you desire to stay. That's, I think, enough with regard to the format. Let me share a word with you about decorum. First of all, to you as members of the audience, I would admonish you, or I would exhort you to listen carefully to the arguments and the evidence of both men with fairness and courtesy. I think in the interest of the debate There should be no such things as jeering or catcalls or raucous applause or the like. These will not be tolerated. We're here to give careful consideration to this issue, and it should not be turned into a three-ring circus. And secondly, to the debaters. As your moderator, I will expect you to treat each other with professional aplomb and with courtesy. There should be no hint of name-calling or character assassination. You will disagree, and I fully expect that, and I will expect you to disagree agreeably. With those things in mind, we will now proceed to our opening statement by Dr. Gish.
Well, it certainly is my pleasure to be here in Michigan, particularly here at Grand Valley State College. I spent 11 years in Kalamazoo while I was with the Upjohn Company, and so I'm always pleased to come back to this area. My only regret is I can't stay longer. I must go back to San Diego tomorrow because I have someplace else to go on Thursday. But it's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity of presenting the scientific case for creation. Dr. Weinshank is a very fine gentleman. I'm sure our time is going to be a cordial exchange of views. We certainly trust that what we will generate here tonight will be much more light than heat. Of course, heat is one of the byproducts of the generation of light, usually, but we hope we can keep it at a low wattage. But we really want to exchange our views on this vitally important subject of origins. Of course, both of us, Dr. Weinshank and myself, feel that it's very, very important, obviously, or we would not be here. And so we want to express our appreciation to those that have arranged this and invited us here to participate in this important issue of creation and evolution. Now, first of all, I want to point out what is not at issue, as far as I am concerned. Now, I give Dr. Weinshank certainly complete freedom to talk about anything he wants to talk about. I don't want to limit him in any way. Just let me say what I'm not going to talk about. As far as I am concerned, the age of the earth is not at issue here tonight. What we're talking about is the development of life and of living things. Did it happen naturally? Was it a process of self-transformation according to properties inherent in matter? Or were these living things created in some way that would not involve a naturalistic process of self-transformation? In other words, a supernatural origin as a result of the direct, deliberate acts of an omnipotent creator. Now, of course, evolution would require an immensity of time. We understand that. As far as the creationists are concerned, well, there's creationists on both sides of this issue of the age of the earth, so it simply does not then end up being an issue. Now, furthermore, the biblical record of creation is not an issue here. We're not going to talk about anything related to the Bible or religious literature of any kind. And, of course, nobody's, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to talk about Dr. Weinshank's theology because I don't know anything about it. I'm not going to talk about mine or Dr. Henry Morse's theology or anything like that. I understand we will be presenting some statement about the implications of this. But otherwise, we're not going to talk about that subject. What we are interested in here tonight is how did we get here? That is, ultimately speaking, where did we come from? How can we account for our origin, for the origin of living organisms, the origin of life, and the origin of all of these living organisms? Now, let me very briefly review the whole continuum of evolution. Now, we're not going to discuss tonight the origin of the universe. We're not going to discuss the second law of thermodynamics and things like that. But I want you to understand that the evolutionary continuum certainly goes back beyond the first living thing. First of all, you had to have an earth for life to evolve on. And to have the earth, the solar system, you had to have a universe. And so where did all this come from? Well, evolutionists postulate, at least one of the more popular theories, tells us that the origin of the universe started with some big bang, billions of years ago. They believe that all the energy and matter of the universe was crammed together in some huge cosmic egg billions of years ago. Now, nobody has the faintest idea where the cosmic egg came from or how it got there. Someone suggested maybe the cosmic chicken laid the cosmic egg. Well, I've never heard a better scientific explanation than that yet. But anyhow, there it was, and it exploded, and out of this explosion, hydrogen gas was generated, and this hydrogen gas expanded out into the vast stretches of the universe. Now that was the universe. You should understand that's all there was, just hydrogen gas at that time, billions of years ago. Now we have people. And may I have that first slide, please? I just want to emphasize, and we're going to have to turn out some of these lights, or we're not going to be able to see the slides quite obviously. I want to emphasize the complexity of life. I'm going to talk about the origin of life, at least briefly, but I want to emphasize what we have to explain. Let's see if we can get that focused a little bit better. Now, you and I, we have about 30 trillion cells in our bodies of over 200 varieties. We have about 12 billion brain cells, and since each brain cell is connected to about 10,000 other brain cells, that means we have more than 120 trillion connections in the human brain. Now, according to this theory, then, you and I, and all of that is a product of hydrogen gas, ultimately speaking. Someone had said then, well, if that's true, hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given sufficient time, becomes people. And of course, this is what the theory embraces. Now, I don't know whether Dr. Weinshank accepts that, but we'll let him speak to that if he wishes. But this is the general evolutionary concept. Now, as a scientist, I find this to be irrational, unscientific, and of course totally impossible in the light of known natural laws and processes and the laws of probability. But that is the scope of the naturalistic view of origins. Now, the creation scientist says this is impossible according to natural laws and processes that are now operating in the universe. And if we take the complexity of life, even the complexity of the most primitive living cell imaginable, and try to determine the probability of that happening through a process of self-transformation according to the laws of chemistry and physics and every other consideration that we can use, we find that that is absolutely impossible. And if the universe and living organisms could not have created themselves naturally, there's only one other possibility. They had to be created supernaturally. Now, I don't care what we call creation. I don't care whether you call it religion. I don't care whether you call it science. I don't care whether you call it something in between. I am interested in the truth. How did we get here? Not what sort of a definition we can put on it. The circuit courts and the Supreme Court and others have said, essentially, that no matter how much scientific evidence can be gathered and adduced to support creation, they still call it a religious concept. Well, I don't care. I don't care what you call it. As a matter of fact, truly, neither creation nor evolution are scientific theories. Neither one is a scientific theory. Because scientific theories must be supported by events, processes, events, and properties which are repeatedly observable. And of course, there were no human witnesses to any of these events. They happened only once in the unobservable past. Creation and evolution are inferences based upon circumstantial evidence. They are theories about history. And in that sense, creation is every bit as scientific as evolution, and certainly no more religious. But putting that aside, what about living organisms? What about life itself? Could they come about naturally? Now, if you can disprove that, of course, there is only one other alternative. They had to be created supernaturally. Sometimes evolutionists say, oh, there are just hundreds of different explanations. I always say there's a naturalistic process of self-transformation. There's a supernatural, omnipotent creation or creator. I says, what's the third? And nobody's ever been able to suggest a third. There's just no other possibility. So let's take a look now at, is it possible that life could have created itself naturally? Is it possible that life could have arisen spontaneously on this planet? Well, the changer is not working. Is there somebody up there who can change the slide in the booth? All right, good. Now, I don't want to spend too much time with this slide projector. Is there somebody who can adjust it or focus up there, please? Well, anyhow, This is a structure of an enzyme. All enzymes are proteins, as you probably are aware. There are 20 different kinds of amino acids. And we find that each enzyme or any protein comprises a rather precise arrangement of the amino acids. Now, not exactly precise. You can do some things with these amino acids, not much. But you see, in this particular protein, an enzyme, we have lysine, number 1, glutamic acid, number 2, threonine, alanine, lysine, phenylalanine, glutamic acid, arginine, glutamine, and so forth and so on. 124 amino acids, 20 different kinds, arranged in precise order. Now, when those amino acids are arranged in that order, then you have this enzyme, which is ribonuclease, the enzyme that helps us to digest the ribonucleic acid we get in our dinner. Now, if we take those same 20 amino acids, arrange them in a different order, 287 of them, we have hemoglobin, the red blood protein. Not an enzyme. It doesn't catalyze any chemical reaction. It binds oxygen. Or we take those same 20 amino acids, about 188 of them, and arrange them in a different order, we have human growth hormone. Not an enzyme. Doesn't bind oxygen, but it's a hormone. Now, what is responsible for this very precise, incredibly efficient biological activity? It's the precise arrangement of those amino acids. How did that happen? Well, the evolutionist says, pure chance. There were no biochemists there. There were no master engineers. Nothing, nobody, no intelligence, no purpose. It just happened. So it's pure chance. Well, one can calculate then the probability of something like this happening by pure chance. Obviously, the probability of getting lysine number 1 is 1 out of 20 if you did it blindly. Even less than that, but I don't have to go into some of these other details. And then the chance of getting the first two, lysine and glutamic acid, in that order is 1 over 20 times 1 over 20, 1 out of 400. The first 3 is 1 out of 8,000. The first 4 is 1 out of 160,000. The first 5 is 1 out of 3,200,000 and some odd thousand. When you get up to 124, you have to multiply 1 over 20 times itself 124 times. Now, by that time, the probability is absolutely, flatly 0 for all practical purposes. I mean, if you tried that, if you could put those 124 amino acids together 1 trillion times a second for 5 billion years or 20 billion years, you wouldn't have a ghost of a chance of having one single molecule in that order. That's how improbable that is. But if it did happen, you would have one single molecule of one single protein. But you've got to have billions of tons, perhaps trillions of tons, of hundreds of different kinds of protein molecules, and billions of tons of hundreds or thousands of different kinds of DNA and RNA molecules, and many others, in an ocean containing 350 million cubic miles of water in order to get life started. Now, there's no way that it's ever going to happen naturally. It's impossible. Incredible. Even if you simplify the problem and simplify it and make all kinds of simplifying assumptions, you are up against impossible odds. But if you had an ocean full of all this stuff, you still wouldn't get life. There's not a slightest probability that it would ever happen. Life, of course, is incredibly complex. You've got to have a membrane. We're only now beginning to understand something about the structure and function of membranes. They are so complex. You've got to have energy factories, you've got to have protein factories, you've got to have the genetic material, and it has to be put together in just a certain way for life to function. Now, what is the probability that that's going to happen by some natural process? It's flatly 0. There's no probability whatsoever that that would happen in even hundreds of billions of years on this planet. Absolutely no probability whatsoever. The natural tendency of these molecules is not to get organized. They don't say to each other, hey, fellas, we're just floating around the water here doing nothing useful. Let's get together in meaningful metabolic cycles. Let's start cooperating together. Let's start doing something. No, that doesn't happen at all. What happens naturally is they break apart, they disperse, they deteriorate, they decay, they hydrolyze. Everything goes towards disorder. That's what happens naturally, and yet naturally that living cell or something similar to it supposedly organized itself. Incredible idea, strictly a nature myth. Now, here's a newspaper article that appeared in the Daily Express of London August 14th, 1981, two skeptical scientists put their heads together and reached an amazing conclusion. There must be a God. Now, I don't believe that's quite such an amazing conclusion, but it was to these two scientists, because when they began their work, they were both atheists. One of these scientists, Sir Fred Hoyle, the British astronomer, if not the world's foremost astronomer, certainly one of the world's foremost astronomers, and his friend, Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, professor and chairman of the Department of Applied Mathematics and Astronomy, University College, Cardiff, Wales, also a very well-known British astronomer. These two scientists became interested in the problem of the origin of life a number of years ago. First of all, they made certain assumptions about the minimum requirement to get life started. And really, they made very minimum assumptions. And then they calculated the probability of life evolving on this planet in 5 billion years. The probability, 1 chance out of 10 to the 40,000th power. That's 1 chance out of the number 1, followed by 40,000 zeros. I assure you that is flatly zero. So they said, obviously, life did not evolve on this planet, but after all, we have 100 billion galaxies. There's 100 billion stars in every galaxy. Let us assume that every star in the universe had a planet like the Earth. Let us assume that the universe is 20 billion years old. Now let's calculate the probability of life evolving somewhere in the universe in that 20 billion years. The answer came back, forget about it. The probability was so low, it was essentially nil. Sir Fred Hoyle said the probability of evolution is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. Well, I tell people, if you want to believe that, that's okay, but let's don't call it science. Now, they concluded, therefore, that life could not have evolved naturally anywhere in the universe. Therefore, it had to be created supernaturally. Therefore, there must be a God. Did they reach this position as creationists? By the way, they don't know who this creator is. They don't know anything about him. All they say is this: wherever life exists in the universe, it had to be created. Did they reach that conclusion because of their religion? Obviously not. Because when they began their studies, they were both atheists. They reached that conclusion in spite of their religion. You see, it was the cold, hard facts of science that convinced these two scientists. And I maintain that now that they've become creationists and speak about creation, what they have to say is not religion any more than when they were evolutionists and they were talking about evolution. The moment that they became convinced creationists, that doesn't mean from then on everything they had to say about the subject was religion. No, it's based upon pure science. Now, we could say much, much more about this, but I think if we just analyze this problem carefully. Now, scientists approached this question very confidently 50 years ago, but now many of these who have been in this field all those years are now beginning to express strong doubts whether there is ever going to be a solution to this problem of the origin of life. And I think the reason is not because we are ignorant, not because we don't know all the facts, not because there's much we don't know, and that's true. It's not what we don't know that troubles me about the theory of evolution. It's what we do know. We do know the laws of thermodynamics. We do know chemical thermodynamics and kinetics. We do know the laws of probability. We do know, or we're beginning to understand, this incredible complexity of life. And that is enough to convince us that life could not have created itself naturally. Therefore, it had to be created supernaturally. Now, let's leave this area of what could have happened. Is it possible? Is it reasonable? Let's see what really did happen. How are we going to get an answer to that? Now, we'll never get an absolute answer. None of us were there. We didn't see what happened. But we have some evidence from which we can infer what may have happened. And that's the fossil record. Now, if evolution is true, if we began with a little single-cell organism billions of years ago, and as this little organism began to reproduce itself, it began to make mistakes. They're called mutation, genetic accidents, genetic mistakes. Now, all evolutionists recognize that almost all mutations are bad. As far as I have been able to discover, I am not aware of a single good mutation. As far as I can determine, they're all bad. They all render the organism less viable or less fertile or non-fertile. But the evolution says, well, yes, almost all mutations are bad. And they produced all hundreds of genetic diseases in man, for example. But once in a while, by pure chance, one of these genetic mistakes, which is made when the organism reproduces its genes, that is, produces somehow, purely by chance, a beneficial effect, so that the creature now has gained an advantage compared to the original. And so in the struggle for existence, the struggle for survival and so forth in competition, even though it begins as a very tiny fraction of the population, eventually after thousands of generations, it replaces the original. So we have a slight change. And then after many, many bad mutations, we finally get another happy accident. We get another good mutation. And then we have another struggle for existence and elimination of the less fit. And we have another slight change. And after millions and millions of DNA accidents, here we are, people, having been produced from this little single-cell organism. And that's true of everything on the face of the earth. Every plant, every animal has been produced from this first form of life, or very few forms of life. Now, if that's true, and I don't care whether you believe in slow, gradual evolution, the neo-Darwinian view, or whether you believe in punctuated equilibrium of Stephen Jay Gould and other people like that, doesn't make any difference. Even with punctuated equilibrium, you're going to have an untold number of intermediate forms, intermediate species. Hundreds of millions of years, supposed evolution, producing millions of species during that vast stretch of time. The number of intermediate forms that would have lived and died during that vast stretch of time would be billions times billions, and most likely times billions again. If we find only a very tiny fraction of all of the creatures that ever lived as fossils, it would be sufficient to give us a very good sampling of the fossil record. Our museum should contain tens of thousands of undoubted intermediate forms or transitional forms. Do you know our museums contain about 250,000 different fossil species represented by tens of millions of fossils? We have a tremendously rich fossil record. So rich it's very difficult to handle. If evolution is true, there would be so many undoubted intermediate forms beyond question. I would not be on this platform tonight. There'd be no Creation Research Society. There'd be no Institute for Creation Research. There'd be nothing that could be called a scientific creationist. That would be, it'd be so plain and so real. On the other hand, if creation is true, we'd expect something very different. We'd expect each one of the created kinds, each one of the basic types of plants and animals, or basic morphological designs, to appear fully formed at the start. An onion would always be an onion. A rose would always be a rose. A tiger would always be a tiger. People would always be people. Cats would always be cats, and dogs would always be dogs. Snails would always be snails, right from the start. We would not expect to find a series of intermediates linking these creatures to a common ancestor. Each basic type then would appear abruptly fully formed. And that would be powerful, positive evidence for creation. Well, let's take a look at the fossil record and see what we find. Now, no doubt Darwin knew the fossil record was an embarrassment to his theory. He said it was. One of the strongest arguments against his theory was the fossil record. But he felt the future would take care of the problem. We'd find the missing links. Ladies and gentlemen, it's 125, 130 years after Darwin, and the missing links are still missing. What we have in the fossil record is the abrupt appearance, fully formed, of each basic type without the intermediates demanded by the theory of evolution. I can give just 2 examples that will be sufficient to establish that fact, although I'm going to give many more. Now, here in this slide, we see the reproduction of creatures whose fossils are found in so-called Cambrian rocks. Evolutionists believe the Cambrian rocks began to form 600 million years ago, and they took about 80, 90, or 100 million years to form. Now, I must confess, I don't have the foggiest notion how you get fossils under conditions like that, where sediment settles out of the water just a fraction of an inch per year. Now, no animal is going to lie down on the bottom of the ocean or lie out on the ground and just wait to be covered, hundreds and thousands of years of sediment to cover it. No, nothing is going to be left, because bacterial decomposition and chemical action and scavengers will destroy everything. So the very presence, the very existence of these massive fossil graveyards is really a mystery on the basis of evolutionary assumption. But let's put that problem aside. We have these rocks now with this tremendous assemblage of incredibly complex invertebrates. We have, for example, trilobites, sea urchins, the jellyfish, branching sponges, swimming crustacean Cytnia, sea lilies, snails, clams, brachiopods, worms, a great variety of very complex invertebrates, supposedly having evolved from that first form of life, that little microscopic form of life. Now, if that's true, then in the rocks which generally underlie the Cambrian rocks, simply referred to as Precambrian rocks, in those rocks, which evolutionists believe were laid down during the hundreds of millions of years before the Cambrian, rocks which in many cases are undisturbed, perfectly suitable for the preservation of fossils. Now, in those rocks, then, we must find the intermediate forms, the transitional form between the microscopic single-cell organism and these very complex creatures. Now, in the Precambrian rocks, we do find fossils of microscopic bacteria and algae. There are now in the scientific literature many reports of the discovery of these little microscopic, soft-bodied, single-cell organisms. Now, if we can find fossils of creatures like that, I think you will agree we could find fossils of everything intermediate between those creatures and these creatures. What does the record show? Ladies and gentlemen, nowhere on the face of this earth have we found an ancestor for a single one of those creatures. Not a single one. I mean, and I don't care where they're found, I don't care when they're found, whether you call them Cambrian or Precambrian, jellyfish are jellyfish. The trilobites are trilobites. Clams are clams. Snails are snails. Sea urchins are sea urchins. Sponges are sponges, right from the start. Nobody has found a single ancestor for one of those creatures. Not a single one. So-called ediacaran fauna, found originally in Australia and around the world now, certainly could not be intermediate. First of all, they're very complex creatures. Secondly, they're so fundamentally different than these animals, they could not possibly be their ancestors. Now, here is a gap of immense proportion. Here's a gap which there is no question that it is real. There is no quarrel between creationist and evolution concerning this gap. I mean, there just are no intermediate forms. There are no transition forms. Now, you can believe anything you want. You can dream up any kind of a scenario you want. But the facts are the intermediate forms are not found. Now, the sudden appearance of this great variety of invertebrates, fully formed, many different phyla. As a matter of fact, in these rocks are over 300 different basic body plans. And there are no intermediate forms, no transitional forms, no links. That settles the question. I can sit down now and end my exposition concerning the fossil record. That settles it. Where did we come from eventually? From one of these invertebrates, but they don't have ancestors. Then we don't have ancestors, you see. Evolution demands a continuum. There must be no break, no gaps from that first form of life to you and I. But there are immense gaps. No question about it, no quarrel, no dispute. Now there's another immense gap immediately. It is suggested that one of these invertebrates evolved into fishes. Fishes are vertebrates. They have internal skeletons like you and I have a backbone. These are invertebrates. It is suggested that one of these invertebrates may be a simple soft-bodied form like a jellyfish or a worm, or maybe one of these things, the hard exoskeleton or shell, maybe a sea urchin, something like that, evolved into fishes. They believe it took 100 million years, something like that. Now, how many of these things would live and die during that 100 million years? Billions times billions of those things would have lived and died. Our museum should have hundreds of thousands of the fossils of the intermediates. Why not? We have billions of these fossils, and billions times billions are potentially available. We have tens of millions of fossil fishes in our museums. What do we have? Not one single intermediate. Not one, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, there's just no quarrel about that. There's no question about it. Now, one can argue, well, maybe the sea urchin was the ancestor because of this and that reason, or maybe or the worm was the ancestor. Practically every invertebrate has been chosen as their ancestor one time or another. There's absolutely no evidence for such a thing. And evolution means change. One thing has to change into another. Do you mean to tell me we could have 100 million years of evolution? At which time the population of the intermediates would number probably in the billions. They're successful, that's why they evolved. And you can't cover up 100 million years of evolution. Dr. Arrow White, a very famous British scientist, expert on fishes, has said as far as he knew, as far as he was aware, every major kind of fish had its origins firmly based in nothing, absolute nothing. And he's not a creationist. Why would people believe in evolution then? Not because of the evidence you see, but in spite of the evidence. Now, ladies and gentlemen, here are two immense gaps. Again, there is no question that they're real. There is no dispute about any hypothetical intermediates in there. Or, I mean, based upon any hard evidence, fossil record, there's nothing like that. Ladies and gentlemen, that evidence shows the vertebrates have not evolved. I mean, they just pop into the fossil record fully formed. You and I are vertebrates. The fishes then must be our ancestors. But they don't have any ancestors. You see? Then we don't have ancestors. It's really useless, it's unnecessary to talk about anything else as far as the fossil record is concerned. We've already established the fact the fossil record is very strongly powerful, positive support for creation. Right here. You see, in the origin of these invertebrates and the origin of the vertebrates, or the fishes. Absolutely no ancestors, no intermediates, and therefore no evolution. But let's continue. Take a look at some of the rest of the fossil record. It is suggested that a fish made the transition to the land. We made the transition from water to land, and so some fish somehow, for some reason, evolved into an amphibian. That means the fins somehow were able to support the body and get out on land, and for some reason, I don't know why. But suppose they evolved into something like this salamander, the red eft, something like that, and so we'd expect some transitional form. Well, there's the fish that supposedly was the ancestor of the amphibian. Lower portion of the slide, we see the world's oldest known amphibian. Now, they suggested that fish was the ancestor for several reasons. There's some bones in the fins they believe could have evolved into the feet and legs of the amphibian. Of course, you notice he has three other fins, which somehow he managed to get rid of. But these others evolved into feet and legs, we are told. There's a similarity in the vertebrae, and there's a similarity in the pattern of bones in the skull. And that's supposed to show that that fish was the ancestor of the amphibian. Look at the fish. What do you see? 100% fish. I mean, it was marvelously designed for life in the water. Look at the amphibian. What do you see? You see an amphibian with the basic amphibian limb, feet and legs. Furthermore, the pelvic bone of the fish is very small and loosely embedded in muscle with no connection to the vertebral column. You don't need any. The fins do not support the weight of the body. But look at the pelvic bone of the amphibian. It's very large and firmly anchored to the vertebral column. That's the kind of anatomy you must have for this four-legged locomotion. There's not one single intermediate in any museum in the world. Not one. There simply are no intermediates. Now, flight is a good test case of creation versus evolution because flight supposedly evolved at least four times, in the flying insects, the birds, flying bats, the mammals, the flying mammals are bats, and flying reptiles. And of course, each process would have required millions of years of time, and so we have multiplied opportunities to find transitional forms. Let's see what we find. Well, here's a fossil dragonfly. That creature is supposed to be somewhere between 350 and 400 million years old. Right from the start, dragonflies were dragonflies. Some had wingspreads 3 feet long, but they were dragonflies. And we found fossils of many other flying insects. We find fossils of non-flying insects. We find fossils of mites, spiders, daddy long-legs, centipedes, supposedly somewhere between 350 million, 400 million years old. Just look like they died yesterday. They're so perfectly preserved. We have fossils of cockroaches. The scientist who studied them, she said that those cockroaches look disgustingly similar to modern cockroaches. So we have all kinds of fossils. We have all kinds of flying insects, but we do not have, listen, one single fossil of an intermediate. I mean, evolutionists argue among themselves, what on the non-flying insect gave rise to wings? Why? Because we've never found an intermediate. Find an intermediate. You'll be famous and you'll settle the argument. Absolutely no intermediate form. And then here's the flying reptile. The flying reptile is believed to have become extinct at the time of the dinosaurs. This is a pteranodon. There are other kinds of flying reptiles. Pteranodon with a long fourth finger. All flying reptiles had very long fourth fingers. Now, according to the theory of evolution, then we had this ordinary land reptile millions of years ago, several hundred million years ago. And then he had a mutation, genetic accident, and the fourth finger's got just a wee bit longer. Now, for some inexplicable reason, that conferred survival value, and so the reptile with a slightly longer finger replaced the original. And then after a lot of bad mutations, got another good mutation, and his fingers got just a wee bit longer again. And after thousands of these mutations, the fingers got longer and longer and longer and longer, and would you believe it, at the same time, other genetic accidents or genetic mistakes generated the flight muscles, the wing membrane, the hollow bones, changed, in the case of Pteranodon, jaws and teeth into that long toothless beak, and a little bony knob and that long bony crest, during millions of years of time. Now, if that's true, certainly we ought to find some of the intermediates. We have never found a trace. Not a trace. These flying reptiles appear fully formed, just as if somebody had created them. Exactly. Powerful, positive evidence for creation. What about the bats? Well, here's a picture of the world's oldest known bat, taken from the cover page of Science, December 9th, 1966. The author of the article, Dr. Glenn Jepson, claimed that those fossil bones were found in rocks 50 million years old. He said nothing related to a bat has ever been found that's any older than that. We also see the reconstruction of what the bat must have looked like. Okay, there we have him. The world's oldest known bat, believed to be 50 million years old. What is he? 100% bat. He's essentially identical to a modern bat, including the incredibly complex sonar system that's found in many modern bats. Complete, right at the start, not a trace of an ancestor, not a trace of a transitional form, and essentially no change in the assumed 50 million years since he appeared on this planet. I maintain that is powerful, positive evidence for creation. But we must not forget Archaeopteryx. Everywhere I travel around the world, I'm presented with Archaeopteryx. This is what the evolution has been presenting. Now look, ladies and gentlemen, if evolution were true, tens of thousands of unquestionable transition forms should be very obvious. But yet evolutionists always come back to Archaeopteryx. Now, first of all, I want to point out Archaeopteryx was a bird. It had the basic form and pattern of the avian wing. It had feathers identical to the feathers of modern flying birds. It had a furcula or wishbone. It had perching feet. Recently, they dug the skull out of the limestone, the London specimen, and it turned out to be bird-like, not reptile-like, and many other features which they've studied in the last few years are bird-like. That creature was a bird, and there's no transitional form between that bird and any reptile or between that bird and any other bird. But it is maintained that it has many reptilian features. Well, as I've just described, many of them have been shown to be bird-like. But they point out that he had teeth, he had claws on the wings, a long tail, and a few other features like that. Do these features indicate that he came from a reptile? Maybe, but maybe not. What about the teeth? Well, modern birds do not have teeth. But some birds had teeth and some did not. Some ancient birds had teeth and some did not. Now that's not surprising because that's true of all other vertebrates. Some fishes have teeth, some do not. Some reptiles have teeth, some do not. Some amphibians have teeth, some do not. Most of you have teeth, some do not. And, well, that's really irrelevant. But what is relevant is the presence or absence of teeth proves nothing about ultimate ancestry. What about the claws on the wings? So happens there are several birds living today that have claws on the wings. The Hoatzin has 2 claws on the wings, bird living in South America. The Turako in Africa has claws. And the ostrich has 3 very nice claws on its wings, but nobody would suggest for a moment that they're transitional forms because they're very much alive and well today. Now, furthermore, and I think this is the crusher, recently, Dr. Chatterjee of Texas Tech University and his fellow workers discovered several fossil birds in Texas. Now, they claim that these birds are 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is supposed to be about 150 million years old. These birds, all of one kind, are supposed to be 225 million years old. Now, you're an evolutionist. You believe that Archaeopteryx was on its way to becoming a bird from a reptile. Now you find fossils of another creature, bird-like creature, 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx. What would you expect? You'd expect to find a very reptile-like bird, wouldn't you? As a matter of fact, back then, supposedly 225 million years ago, that's when the dinosaurs stepped on this planet, first appeared. Right back there. You'd expect to find a very reptilian bird. As a matter of fact, that bird is even more bird-like than Archaeopteryx. More bird-like. Has an established keel, has hollow bones, other features that supposedly are not possessed by Archaeopteryx. That bird is even more bird-like. And that just simply destroys the notion, of course, of Archaeopteryx being the ancestor of birds, or anything being the ancestor of birds. I think on a scale of about 1 to 10, as a matter of flight, we'd have to give it to the creationists, about 9.9. That's just about the way that stacks up. Now, dinosaurs are also a remarkable testimony for creation. They appear on every continent of the world, on the north shore of Alaska, down to the southern tip of South America. They occur in all sizes, shapes, and descriptions. Surely we ought to have many transitional forms. This is Triceratops, 3 horns on the head, huge armored plate. Then we have Stegosaurus, no horns on the head, but look at those spikes on the tail, those unusual plates along the back. Those spikes are about 3 feet long, very substantial structure. The plates are very substantial. No intermediates, no transitional forms for the horned dinosaurs or for Stegosaurus, nothing at all showing the evolution of these strange structures. And the duck-billed dinosaurs, this is Trachodon, standing about 18 feet high. We see the duck-bill. There are many different kinds of duck-billed dinosaurs, a great variety of these creatures. They are very numerous. We find many of their fossils, not one single intermediate showing jaws and teeth changing into a duck-bill. Nothing like that has ever been found. Well, I declare, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know where that slide come from. I didn't intend to show that. Obviously, that's not a dinosaur. Picture my grandson. Now, here we have Tyrannosaurus rex, jaws about 6 feet long, teeth about 6 inches long. No wonder they call them terrible lizards or dinosaurs. And then we have the great plant-eating dinosaurs, the Diplodocus, 100 feet long, and the great Brontosaurus, the great thunder lizard, or Apatosaurus, about 80 feet long, weighing up to 40 tons, and then the largest dinosaur of all, the Brachiosaurus, standing up to 50 feet high or higher, high as a 5-story building, weighing up to 80 tons or 100 tons, a huge creature, and a most unusual anatomy. The nostrils are not located out on the end of the snout, but in the bony dome on the top of the head. Nobody has the foggiest notion why he had that strange anatomy, but this one thing we do know, we've never found a single intermediate showing the nostrils migrating from the snout into the bony dome on the top of the head. Nothing like that has ever been found. No intermediate between these huge creatures evolving from some little creatures. Not one single intermediate for the origin of these dinosaurs with their unusual structures. I maintain that's powerful positive evidence for creation. Now, very briefly, the origin of man. Here we see the skulls of a creature scientifically called Australopithecus, first discovered by Dr. Raymond Dart in South Africa in 1924. The skull you see here was discovered by Dr. Louis Leakey and his wife Mary in East Africa in 1959. And then more recently, Dr. Donald Johansen, American paleontologist, who found a series of fossils to which he gave the name Australopithecus afarensis, one of which was of a female about 40% complete. Now, he named this creature Lucy, and he claimed that Lucy had the jaws, the teeth, the face, and brain of an ape, and yet she walked upright, just like you and I. And that is the consensus of evolutionists concerning these creatures, even though you can see they're grossly ape-like. and yet it's claimed that they walked upright. Now that's what you read in your textbooks, what you see in National Geographic, it's what you see on television, what you read everywhere, almost. There are some evolutionists who don't believe that. Now these evolutionists certainly have done their homework. They are the leaders in this field. They have spent years and years searching for man's fossil ancestry and studying these fossils. One of these evolutionists, Lord Zuckerman, Dr. Solly Zuckerman, for many years the head of the Department of Anatomy at the University of Birmingham, he searched for man's fossil ancestry. He applied the most sophisticated methods of anatomy available to study these creatures. And the fossils that he studied supposedly were 2 million years younger or more recent than Lucy. Therefore, they should be more man-like, more advanced, so to speak. And yet Lord Zuckerman came to the conclusion that they did not walk upright. They were not intermediate between ape and man, and they certainly were not our ancestors. That conclusion reached by Dr. Charles Oxnard, now a professor of anatomy and head of the graduate studies at University of Southern California Medical School, a man who's applied the best methods of anatomy possible to the postcranial skeleton, having studied their foot bones, their leg bones, their knee joints, their pelvis, and all of that. And Dr. Oxnard said they did not walk upright, certainly not in the human manner. They're not intermediate between ape and man, and they certainly were not ancestral to man. Now, one thing I think offers powerful support of that was the discovery recently by Donald Johanson of a creature called Homo habilis, named by Louis Leakey as being more advanced than the Australopithecus. Therefore, he put it in the genus Homo. Will be a very primitive Homo creature, but nevertheless in the genus Homo. Homo habilis. Well, he discovered this fossil recently of a female, adult female, barely more than 3 feet tall. And they recovered enough of the arms to know that this creature had long arms, the fingertips reaching clear down to the knees. Now all of these creatures, the Australopithecines and this Homo habilis, had long curved fingers and long curved toes. Ladies and gentlemen, what do you use long curved fingers and long curved toes and arms reaching clear down to the knees? For walking around on the ground? I should say not. That certainly is designed for swinging through the trees from branch to branch. And that so-called Homo habilis had a postcranial skeleton practically identical to Lucy. Supposedly Lucy is 2 million years older. We've had 2 million years then for things to evolve and things to happen, and nothing happened. And furthermore, it has these long arms and long curved fingers and long curved toes. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe there's no doubt about it. Lord Zuckerman, Dr. Oxnard, and people who hold those views are the ones who have the correct views, have done the careful research, who've applied multivariate analysis and other very involved methods of analysis to reach these correct conclusions. While Donald Johanson, Tim White like that have glanced, or not glanced, but they've studied these things visually, and they've tried to reconstruct what they must have done and looked like from their visual study. And Lord Zuckerman and Dr. Oxnard have used the best methods of anatomy available, and I believe their conclusions are correct. And if they are correct, then Lucy gets kicked out of the family tree of man. You know, the family tree of man is a very slippery tree. You stick an ancestor up there and he doesn't stay up there very long. He either slips out or he gets kicked out. Let me give you a few examples. We see in the next slide, the Piltdown man, reconstructing a few fragments of a jaw and a few fragments of skull, discovered in a gravel pit near Piltdown, England in 1912. Stood for nearly 50 years, our ancestor, incorporating a very ape-like jaw and a very human-like skull, combining ape-like and human-like characteristics in this one creature until it was shown to be a hoax, a fraud, exposed by a chemist who analyzed for the amount of fluoride in the bones. As bones stand in soil, they absorb fluoride. If there's fluoride in the soil, if that skull and jawbone were the same ages, should have the same amount of fluoride in them. The jawbone had no fluoride at all. It was not a fossil. Hadn't been in that crown until earlier than 1912, the year it was found. And the skull certainly wasn't not 500,000 years old as they had estimated. This creature was a complete hoax, a fraud. Somebody had taken a jawbone of a modern ape and a human skull and treated them with chemicals to make them look old and filed the teeth to make them look man-like, put them in the gravel pit, and fool the world's greatest authorities. Why couldn't those authorities identify a human skull as a human skull and an ape's jaw as an ape's jaw? Because they were looking for something. They were expecting to find something, you see. They wanted to find what they thought they were seeing. Then we have the Nebraska man, a single tooth, found in western Nebraska in 1922, brought to the attention of several leading authorities in the United States. They're very excited by the discovery of this tooth. It seemed to have certain characteristics intermediate between ape and man. They couldn't quite decide on which side of the line to place this creature. Was an ape-like man or a man-like ape? Well, the Illustrated London News, based upon the description of these scientists, published a picture of this so-called Nebraska man in 1922. In their Illustrated London News, we see that here on the next slide. There we see the picture of the man. We see the picture of his wife. We see the picture of the tools they were using, all based upon that one single tooth. Really, science is a fascinating subject, isn't it? Well, a few years later, they found the remainder of that creature. Turned out to be neither a man-like ape nor an ape-like man. Turned out to be a pig. That's right, it was the pig's tooth. Ladies and gentlemen, look at that picture. Something very seriously presented to the students in the 1920s as evidence for a human ancestor, nothing more than a pig's tooth.
Dr. Gish, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Now, here we have Neanderthal man. This is a former picture of Neanderthal man, the original view of Neanderthal man, the fossils of which were found in about 1860, and many other fossils were found scattered around Europe and Asia and Israel and so forth. And they portrayed the Neanderthal people as being sort of a long-armed, knuckle-dragging, beetle-browed, stoop-shouldered, bow-legged subhuman. All these subhuman features. Well, it turned out, well, they call him Homo neanderthalensis, his subhuman ancestor. Turned out that these features were not genetic, they were pathological. One of the fossils they had studied was an arthritic old man. He didn't walk upright because he had a bad case of arthritis. The x-rays of bones and teeth of these people showed that they all suffered severely from rickets, a vitamin D deficiency which causes the bones to become soft and deformed. And so all of these primitive features were pathological, not genetic. This is the modern version of Neanderthal man from the American Museum of Natural History, and you can see he's very much Homo sapiens. Neanderthal man was not our ancestor, he was man. The Nebraska man was not our ancestor, he was a pig's tooth. Piltdown man was not our ancestor, he was a hoax, a combination of an ape's jaw and a human skull. Ramapithecus, it turns out, was not our ancestor, he was orangutan. And Orse man had a short lifespan, turned out to be the skull cap of a donkey. And other examples like this. Now, what I want to emphasize, ladies and gentlemen, when you really believe in something so wholeheartedly and completely, you tend to see things that are not there. And that's what we have here. And I think that's what we're seeing in Lucy and these other creatures. I believe the evidence is quite clear. Monkeys have always been monkeys. People have always been people. And apes have always been apes. And they've not been derived from a common ancestor. Now, in the few minutes remaining, I want to put out a challenge to any evolutionist who could explain the development of metamorphosis in a creature like a butterfly. Here we have a monarch butterfly, mates and lays eggs. We see the new egg on the left, developing egg on the right, and it gives rise to a caterpillar. And you see the hole in the leaf eaten by the caterpillar, has mouth parts for chewing the leaves, and of course he crawls, he goes through a number of molts. Here is one of the final stages of this caterpillar. Now here he is, a caterpillar, crawls around, has mouth parts to eat leaves. Now I guess he got an urge to hang glide or something like that. He wanted to become a flying creature. And of course he realizes nothing in a caterpillar to recommend him to be a butterfly or anything like that, or anything else you might imagine. And so he decided he had to go right back to ground zero. And so he programs himself somehow. Here he is attached to a leaf, and he begins to shed that last molt, and then he forms the pupa, the chrysalis. Now he's just dissolved himself into a mass of jelly. But he's got a very clever idea. He's going to program that mass of jelly to be a butterfly. And sure enough, we see the developing butterfly, and eventually he emerges from the cocoon. Here he is. He's got that big fat tummy. He's pumping the fluid from his tummy into his wings, and they stiffen out. Now he's a butterfly, and he flies. Beautiful, beautiful. Butterfly designed to fly with a proboscis for sucking nectar. Totally different than a caterpillar. Now, Darwin said if anyone could come up with a single example of any creature or any structure or any organ that could not be explained by his theory of evolution, slow gradual change, as one thing gradually changing to another through these now we view as mutations, accidental gene changes, through natural selection, that you could destroy his theory. I would defy any evolutionist to explain how a caterpillar could, through genetic accidents or genetic mistakes and a process of natural selection, change from a caterpillar into a butterfly. How could the intermediates exist? What would the intermediates look like? They wouldn't be a butterfly, they couldn't fly, they couldn't crawl, they couldn't do anything. There's no way you can explain that change. I have a book called The Insects, published by Time Life. They refer to this as a miraculous process, and they say there's no explanation for it. And there is no explanation. Yet there must be an explanation. If evolution is true, this must have an explanation. And it must happen through genetic mistakes and genetic accident. And there must be intermediate stages. But I would defy anyone to explain how such a process could take place. Or the metamorphosis in the development of the frog, as it goes from egg to tadpole to frog. Gills don't develop into lungs. Fins don't develop into legs. Nothing like that happens. The adult frog is a complete new creature.
Just less than 5 minutes, Dr. Gish.
So I think, ladies and gentlemen, we have tremendous evidence here. Now, there's much other evidence, ladies and gentlemen, we could use. We're not talking about the second law of thermodynamics, the science of thermodynamics tonight, which I believe is tremendous evidence for creation. Let me just close by reading a word or two. I have a book with me. I think it's a tremendous book. It's not written by a creationist. It's not written by a Christian. Not written by a believer. Dr. Michael Denton, 2 earned doctorates in British universities, now in genetic research in Australia. This book, written by this non-creationist, this non-Christian, Evolution, a Theory in Christ, is published in 1985. It says here, the theory of evolution is propounded by Darwin and elaborated into accepted fact, quote unquote, by biologists, is in serious trouble. This sober, authoritative, and responsible book by a practicing scientist presents an accurate account of the rapidly accumulating evidence which threatens to destroy almost every cherished tenet of Darwinian evolution. Not only has paleontology failed spectacularly to come up with the fossil missing links which Darwin anticipated, but hypothetical reconstructions of major evolutionary developments, such as that linking birds to reptiles, are beginning to look more and more like science fiction fantasies than serious conjectures. And it says, most important of all, the discoveries of molecular biologists, of whom Michael Denton is one, far from strengthening Darwinian claims, are throwing more and more doubt upon the correctness of the whole theory. Dr. Denton devastates evolution theory in this book. But he's not a creationist, not a Christian. His whole prejudice should be going the other direction. Marvelous. Honest assessment of the evidence. Finally, an article appeared in Newsweek, April 8, 1985. Article was by Sharon Begley, Science Contra Darwin. In other words, Science Against Darwin, appeared on page 80. Now, this author is writing about evolutionists. I don't want to give anybody the impression these people are not evolutionists. They are. But she says this, the great body of work deriving from Charles Darwin's revolutionary 1859 book on the origin of species is under increasing attack, and not just from creationists. And she describes a lot of the disputes that's going on, and then she says this, so heated is the debate that one Darwinian says there are times when he thinks about going into a field with more intellectual honesty, the used car business. Now,
2 minutes.
Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to emphasize a creationist did not say that. I did not say that. That was said by an evolutionist about his what's going on here, you see. And it's more than just a quarrel within the family. It's more really than just about the mechanism of evolution. They keep saying, oh, we all recognize the fact of evolution. We only quarrel about the mechanism. I'd like to know how they know evolution is a fact. How did they decide that? The whole mechanism is unknown. The whole mechanism of a mess. They don't have the transitional form, and they don't have the mechanism. Reminds me of what Pogo said to Al, or Al said to Pogo, I forget which. He said we could have bacon and eggs for breakfast if we had some bacon and if we had some eggs. Well, I think evolution would be a fine theory if we had some fossils, if we had a mechanism, but we have neither. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gish. Dr. Weinshank, your opening statement, please. Let's take a brief break just to get up and stretch before we go on with Dr. Weinshank's statement.
Oh, you're right. Thank you. I got pretty dry. Thank you very much. I take it easy first. Yeah, like it's a long one. I'm tired of standing on the water. I can't believe it's the first time I've finished debating 2 or 3 minutes left. I was trying to find something to say. Usually I'm fighting to get through. Well, we left out got that out there. Well, that was a long time. Yeah, that's right. And person from who made the comment after I raised the issue is absolutely correct. I'm not arguing that privilege says that well, I think I agree with that statement. Like I always say that if you know, there's nothing that says there is nothing. Second law of thermodynamics says nothing that law says you can't get a pressure that field. What I'm saying is not. That's where it's up.
We will begin again in 2 minutes. In 2 minutes. If you want to find your way to your seat so that we can begin then promptly in 2 minutes. Please make your way to your seats so that we may begin promptly. Audience members, thank you for your cooperation. Please take your seats.
I wonder if I could, just as a small favor, ask that you restate the issue that we're debating tonight.
The formal question to be debated: does the scientific evidence support the theory of evolution or the theory of special creation as an answer to the development of life?
Thank you. As I made it clear to Dan Hobbs when we talked about this originally, I'm not going to talk about the origin of life. I enormously respect Dr. Gish, but the origin of life to an evolutionist brings in some extraordinarily subtle questions of chemistry and physics, and it's essentially a whole different topic. Perhaps some other time we can get back together and debate that issue. I particularly want to thank all of our hosts for this invitation. The last time, as Dr. Gish mentioned, that we debated was at Northwestern in a bitter cold night in 1976 in the field house, which was unheated. And if it had been for the fact that the debate was a very heated one, we'd probably both frozen to death. This is considerably more pleasant, and we're grateful to you. I want to start out by sketching for you what I think it means to do science. That is, to do the sorts of things that all scientists do all of the time. Then I'm going to try to give you a brief sketch of the various parts of the theory of evolution. And finally, and I discussed this thoroughly with Dan Hobbs when he called me originally, I want to take a couple of minutes and talk about the religious dimensions of this question, and because I feel it's very important. And when I get to this third part, I particularly want you to be on your guard. I know a little about science because I've been making my living at it for a long time, but I don't have any special expertise to talk about religion, and you must carefully evaluate everything I say at that point against your own knowledge of science and your own religious beliefs. I want you to pay especially careful attention to everything I say tonight. If at any time any of it seems to make sense to you, that is, if it seems to agree to your common sense notion of the ways things work, then either you aren't understanding what I'm talking about, or more likely I'm doing a very poor job of explaining. I want to stress this because the single most important thing I want to tell you tonight is that common sense is a totally unreliable guide to modern science. Einstein, in fact, says somewhere that common sense is that collection of prejudices that one acquires up to age 18. Common sense is based on our everyday experience of things as they are: coffee cups, bowling balls, automobiles, airplanes, and so on. In short, common sense is the way that we make internal pictures for ourselves about the way things work. However, modern science has gone far beyond dealing with everyday sorts of things. Somebody, and I don't at the moment remember who, said science today deals with the very big and the very small and the very fast and the very slow, all of which are not directly observable. We deal with the very big, such as the size of the universe, and the very small, such as the parts of which the nucleus of the atom are made, and the very fast, such as light pulses and atomic particles moving in accelerators, and the very slow, such as geology and evolution, which have time frames measured in thousands or millions or even billions of years. We don't observe any of these things. Instead, what we do is make if-then statements about them. If my theory is correct, then I should count this many particles when I do an experiment. If my theory is correct, then I should get this meter reading when I add an enzyme. If my theory is correct, then I should find the same rocks and fossils at these two locations, one in South America and the other in Africa. In some cases, we are making predictions about things which will happen in the future. In other cases, we are making predictions about things that happened in the past, but which we have yet to observe and yet to measure in the present. The process is deductive. In both cases, we go from a general statement, such as a theory, to a specific statement, a predicted observation, which we believe is the consequence of that theory. The important thing here is that we don't know the results that we will obtain until we actually make the if-then predictions and actually go out and see if these predictions are right or wrong. Any time that you know in advance what the right answer has to be, you are not doing science, but something else. This is the deductive part of doing science today, and it is the process that all scientists go through irrespective of discipline. However, it is also helpful to remember that this is not the way in which scientific theories are created. Theory building is inductive, going from observations to possible explanations, which the scientists can dream up. And in this first transparency, I have sketched something about the relationship between observation and theory. I hope you can all see that in the back. People build informal, casual hypotheses to account for the observations. These hypotheses, in turn, suggest new observations that should be there if the hypotheses are good ones. And this back and forth process goes on for some time. Eventually, if the scientist is a good one and his or her hypotheses are good ones, it becomes possible to construct a theory. I particularly want you to notice that the observations are the facts of the world, and that they are the same no matter what hypotheses and no matter what theories we construct. Everything that is above the line I've drawn is what goes on in the human mind. The facts, the observations, remain the same, and any new hypotheses or theories must take into account all of the old, all of the known observations, not just the convenient ones. Now, when we get to the level of a theory is a very formal set of rigorous statements. A theory has to do three things. It has to explain all the known facts. It can't select some and ignore others. For example, we find trilobites in several of the lower layers of the Grand Canyon and amphibian and reptilian fossils in the upper layers. A good theory can't explain this by telling you that small round things sediment faster than large angular things. It can't explain things in this way because it must take account of the fact that we find thousands of feet of terrestrial layers, of land layers at the Grand Canyon, sandwiched between the marine layers that contain the trilobites. A good theory must account for all of these facts. Secondly, a good theory never stands alone. It always has implications for other theories, and other theories always have implications for it. And I've indicated it this way on the slide. Here might be the theory of evolution, here might be a theory about radioactive decay, here a theory about continental drift. A case in point is the relationship between evolution and continental drift. Any fourth grader notices that South America and Africa fit together like a lock and key. In fact, if you do that fit not at the sea level, but say 200 meters down, far below the area where erosion is present, the fit is even better than it is at the surface. It probably won't surprise you to learn that the rocks and fossils at the northeast tip of South America exactly match those in Africa and are completely unrelated to the surrounding rocks and fossils in which they are embedded. When the continents drifted apart, perhaps 60 million years ago, a good-sized chunk of Africa was left behind, embedded in what we today call South America. Again, theories have implications for other theories. Finally, and this is most important, a good theory can never have a predetermined outcome. You must be willing to follow a theory wherever it leads and willing to revise your conclusions on the basis of the most recent data. This is taken from Engel's paper in the American Scientist, which is in that list of readings I distributed. It graphs the age of the Earth, here's the age of the Earth in billions of years, against the year in which the age was proposed. So back here around 1900, it's pretty short, and up here around 1970, we're up somewhere around our current value of about 4.5 to 4.8 billion years. While nothing now suggests that the age is likely to change very much, if there are any convincing reasons for do so, we will certainly change our estimate of the age of the Earth and change all of our textbooks and do so without a backward glance. In contrast, if you know in advance that the Earth is 6 24-hour days old or 10,000 years or whatever number is required by the creationist model, which invokes a short age span for the Earth, if you know this in advance, then you aren't doing science, but something else. I want to take just a couple of more minutes to talk about the nature of science, and then I'm going to turn to the theory of evolution itself. Here are 3 rules by which all scientists work. I don't mean they necessarily rush into their labs in the morning and read these over before putting on their lab coats, but these rules are pretty generally understood, explicitly or implicitly, by all working scientists. Causality is a rule that is essentially cast in stone for all of us. Science asks how questions, but never why questions. How was this or that effect caused? What were the multiple causes that resulted in the Challenger explosion? What were the effects of cooling and drying which occurred at the end of the Permian? How did this change the environment, the plant life, and the animal life? These are scientific questions, questions about causality. Science does not ask why questions, questions about the meaning and purpose of life. And if you ever encounter a scientist who attempts to foist this off on you, you have my permission to beat him or her mightily about the ears. The second law that I would say all scientists subscribe to is the law of uniformity. Uniformity says that the same scientific laws apply everywhere and every when, that is, at all times. If I drop this pen, it falls. In fact, it would be true if I dropped it into a bowl of water, because this thing is heavier than water. If I were to substitute a grain of sand for the pen, it too would fall in water. If I were to drop many grains of sand into water, they would form a layer at the bottom. The layer would be horizontal. Therefore, when I observe that the layers of the sedimentary rock at the Grand Canyon in many places are tipped rather than horizontal, I'm going to conclude on the basis of my rule of uniformity that they were originally laid down in horizontal layers and then at some subsequent time tipped by movements of the crust of the Earth. Of course, I wasn't there, nor was Dr. Gish, to observe these layers being tipped eons ago, but that doesn't bother me. My deduction, that is horizontal deposition followed by tipping, follows from my general assumption of uniformity, an assumption which has kept me and all scientists on the straight and narrow for the past 200 years since Newton. There's only one other thing that I must tell you about the rule of uniformity. Uniformity says that the same laws apply at all times, not that the same results will occur. In fact, given different starting conditions, the same laws will produce very different results. Think about that the next time you play poker or chess or Monopoly. You abide by the same rules of the game every time you play it, but no 2 results are the same. The rule of uniformity is, as I said, one of those cast in stone for the scientist. If you want to make up rules which apply sometimes, but not at other times, you are free to do so, but you are not free to call what you do science. Science, as I say, never asks why questions. A why question is too important to be left to science and must be answered by religion and philosophy. The third rule of science, the third ironclad rule, is testability. Testability is, as I said earlier, the case where scientists make if-then statements about the world and proceed to test those statements. A theory which cannot be tested in this way, for example, because it invokes the one-time intervention in the world by God Almighty himself, is not a scientific theory at all. And one last thing. Science can never answer all questions that can be asked at a particular time. I don't know is a perfectly good scientific answer. If you do know in advance the answers to all questions which can be asked, what you are doing is not science. Now let me turn to the theory of evolution. Let me have slide 1, if I may. That's Charles Darwin. I start off my course in natural science by telling my students that Darwin could not pass my final exam, at least not if he skipped class. And there are some very good reasons for that. The theory of evolution has changed beyond all recognition since Darwin's day. And I say that in spite of the fact that I enormously respect Darwin's contribution to science and in fact publish with Paul Barrett concordances to Darwin's work. Some of these are on the reading list which I distributed. But first of all, Darwin's notion of inheritance was completely dead wrong. He had never heard of Gregor Mendel, the geneticist, and genetics was not joined to evolution until well into this century. Secondly, there are many new classes of evidence about which Darwin could have known nothing. I tell you all this because of something interesting that happened last Thursday. Two colleagues and I had spent several months preparing an all-day workshop for the College of Natural Science at Michigan State on the teaching of evolution. We had distributed a collection of readings more than 200 pages long a week in advance, and there were 9 sessions of the workshop crammed with new evidence, new theories, and very heated debate. At the end of the day, I posed this question to the speakers: how shall we introduce students to the theory of evolution today? And one of the panelists replied, tell them that there is no theory of evolution, there is only the field of evolution. What he meant was that evolution now has so many implications in so many different and diverse fields that it is almost impossible to make a single simple set of statements which will cover all of these contingencies. Therefore, I'm going to ask you to bear with me. What I say is abbreviated and is a once-over lightly. In fact, if you took my course on evolution, in 50 hours of lecture and lab, you would get just a taste of the full power of the field of evolution. There are, I think, in the view of most scholars, really two parts to what we call the core theory of evolution: descent with modification and natural selection. The first of these is universally accepted by biological scientists, while the second has been the subject of intense study and heated controversy from Darwin's time to the present. Descent with modification describes what happens in evolution, while natural selection describes how, or at least one of the possible ways in which it can occur. So let me deal with these briefly in turn. Descent with modification starts with the self-evident notion that living things are related in terms of their structures and their behaviors. We are bone for bone, homologous with the great apes. Every bone in you has a corresponding bone in a chimpanzee or gorilla. The difference between you and a chimp, for example, is that your arms are shorter in proportion to your body than the chimp's. When a chimp walks, he rests his hands on the ground, knuckle down, but your arms are too short for that. At the DNA level, at the level of the stuff of which our genes are made, we are about 99.5% identical with a chimpanzee. That is, of the roughly 50 to 100,000 genes which we share, perhaps 500 to 1,000 are different between humans and chimps. At the protein level, the level of the stuff of which our cells and tissues are made, which are obviously coded for by the genes, we're about 99% identical. Our embryos are nearly indistinguishable from those of chimps throughout our development. And I must share with you a story. When our first son was born, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the obstetrics nurse brought him out. In those days, fathers weren't in the delivery room, and said what she had said to a generation of proud fathers: "Isn't he beautiful?" And I replied, not having slept in a couple of days, "He looks like a newborn chimp." And she almost dropped him. But of course, newborn chimps and newborn humans do look very much alike because of their common genes. We also share behaviors at many levels. When I was growing up, we used to say, man is the only tool-making animal. Now, thanks to the work of Jane Goodall listed in your reading list, we know that chimps make tools as well. We like to think of ourselves as the only animal with language. Indeed, many recent and very carefully controlled studies have shown that apes can master American Sign Language, which is used, as you know, by hearing impaired people, or comparable computer-based languages. They cannot talk. because among the genes which they do not share with us are those for the vocal apparatus. However, they do sign, that is, use ASL, in novel and situationally appropriate ways. For example, when the chimp Lana saw her grad student Tim drinking a Coke while he was working at the computer panel, she typed out the computer message, "Please, Tim, give Lana a drink at door," and then ran to the door to await Tim, although she'd never had a Coke before. She put together the instructions in a new and novel way. The fossil record also tells us about descent with modification. And in spite of the huge gaps in the fossil record, and I must tell you that I don't think, in all fairness to Dr. Gish, whom I respect enormously, he didn't begin to do justice to the problems with the fossil record. I refer you to a paper by Jablonski, Gould, and Raup for a detailed analysis of the problem. It's in your reading list. We see a pretty clear temporal sequence of fossils with groups of organisms branching off from earlier groups. The whole question of the fossil record is so enormous that I can only refer you to the reading list. I particularly recommend the book by Bierbauer, an old book, but still a very fine one. I must also remind you that when Darwin wrote The Descent of Man, there was not a single authentic hominid fossil, a fossil in the line to modern man. In fact, the Piltdown forgery only further confused things for a while. Today, however, paleontologists have hundreds of different hominid fossils, skulls, and other parts of the skeleton with which to work. And what I'd like to do is just run through slides 2 through 22, which are taken from a lab exercise that students do at Michigan State University. So if we could have slides 2 through 22, I'd appreciate it. Okay, you can just flip through them if you would. This is Zinjanthropus nutcracker man, whom Dr. Gish referred to. It's sort of like looking at police mugshots. Each of these fossils, and I'm only showing the skulls because skulls are very recognizable. You wouldn't have nearly as much fun looking at an arm bone or a leg bone or a couple of vertebrae, although they equally give wealth of information to the paleontologists. Each of these is a fact. It's something that we have to deal with, and we have to try to figure out how the whole picture fits together in a meaningful way. That's 1470 front view and 1470 side view. From the front view, it looks kind of human. From the side view, it looks anything but human, and in fact it has a skull volume of about half that of modern man. These are all facts. These are not the only kinds of facts. We also have jaws and vertebra, a handful of vertebrae, very illustrative, and pelvises to deal with. Thank you. That's enough slides for the second. I particularly recommend to you along this line the Human Evolution Coloring book, again in your reading list, by Zillman, because she summarizes something like 103 different classes of evidence which bear on the theory. In short, when you're doing science, you're doing a tremendous amount of nitty-gritty work of careful measurement and mathematical analysis. Since we are dealing here in all of these skulls and so forth with real science, we do not know the outcome in advance. Yet it may not surprise you to learn the various ways in which we measure descent with modification, whether from the fossil evidence, from the molecular evidence, from the embryological evidence, give us overlapping but not identical pictures of the evolution of life. For example, the paleontologists think that the line to humans branched away from the line which leads to the great apes, such as the chimp or the gorilla, somewhere between 8 and 15 million years ago. Whereas the folks who do the molecular data, the DNA and protein data, think that the branch was much more recent, say 2 to 4 million years ago. That is what makes science what it is, the constant turmoil, the constant controversy as different scientists come to different conclusions and have to fight them out. Now, that's the idea of descent with modification. Darwin was not the first to postulate the idea of descent with modification. The idea goes back in some form to the Greek scientists. He was, however, the first to try to explain the mechanism, the how, by which descent with modification occurs. Today we recognize several other possible mechanisms and recognize that they are not exclusive, but I'm only going to discuss one, natural selection, since that was Darwin's great contribution. Darwin has several ideas which he puts out very clearly for you to evaluate and test. One is that populations tend to increase exponentially, you know, something like 2, 4, 8, 16. It's not an original idea. Fibonacci in the 12th century was studying rabbits and proposed the series 2, 3, 5, 8, 11, and so forth, for which each term is the sum of the two preceding terms. Well, he was interested in rabbits. In fact, Darwin himself calculated, and I find this an interesting calculation, that the entire surface of the Earth would be covered with elephants in only 1 century if elephants could increase in an unchecked manner. So populations tend to increase exponentially. Point 2. There is a limited food supply. The food supply is either constant or increases very slowly in a linear manner, something like 1, 2, 3, 4. Another observation, and I think all of us recognize the truth of this, numbers of animals or plants in nature remain more or less constant or vary within rather narrow limits in a regular fashion. You don't have thousands of robins on your lawn one year and 2 robins the next. The numbers of robins are roughly the same year after year. Another observation, organisms tend to vary. Within a population of any sexually reproducing plant or animal, there is considerable variation. Now, Darwin's great insight is what we call the struggle for existence. Darwin's conclusion was that there is a struggle for existence in which the fittest individuals within a population survive and reproduce. The interesting thing about this is that Darwin does not mean that animals are, for instance, at war with each other. He used, by my count and my concordance, the term struggle 78 times in Origin of Species. He almost always means this in the context of the ways in which animals and plants deal with their environment, things like food supply, drought, etc. We call, here's the key point here, we call those individuals or plants within a population that are more successful in this struggle, we call them fit. And there's something here that you must understand about the term fitness as Darwin and all modern scientists use it. It is always relative fitness of some individuals in a population with respect to other individuals in that population. To illustrate this, I ask my students, who is more fit, you or a clam? If you think about it, the question is complete nonsense. It has no answer. I don't live on a seabed and strain guck through my gills to get dinner, and a clam doesn't debate creationists. Therefore, the only meaning of fitness is that within a population of clams or within a population of humans, some are relatively more fit than others. There's also something else that you must know about fitness, especially because the creationists always try to confuse you about this point. Fitness is not tautological, that is, it is not circular. A statement like, bachelors are unmarried is tautological. What I am not saying, I repeat for you, what I am not saying is that the term fitness is a thing to which I can point. Instead, it's a property of living things in a population. It sounds like a very subtle point, but it's vitally important that you understand it. Let me give you an example, an analogy. If I say sugar is soluble, you are likely to accept that statement. However, if you've ever made candy, you know that that is a relative statement, one which depends upon the conditions. Sugar is more soluble in warm water than cold, but after you get the solution saturated at a particular temperature, you can't get any more to dissolve. Sugar is probably not soluble to any great extent in things like gasoline and so forth. In short, like solubility, fitness is a relative term relative to the conditions of life, just as soluble is a relative term relative to the conditions under which you attempt to dissolve the sugar. And for a further discussion of this, I would refer you to Sober's 1984 book. Now, what I would like to do is to try to pull these together and give you just one example. It's curious that Dr. Gish mentioned the monarch butterfly, because indeed that's my example as well. The work I'm describing, the interest in the work I'm describing hinges from a statement of Darwin's. My source for Darwin is slightly different than yours, but my reading of it was, show me one species which exists solely for the benefit of another, and you could overthrow all of evolution. I think perhaps you recognize that as well. And the work I'm describing addresses itself to that issue. It's drawn from an article in Scientific American in February of 1969. I'm afraid I goofed and I failed to include that in your reading list, but you can hunt it down if you'd like. The work is important because it attempts to explain how natural selection, operating on a population of viceroy moths, caused that population to evolve in the direction of looking like monarch butterflies. And I should remark in passing that my entomologist colleagues tell me that the viceroy is not a moth at all, but a different group of butterflies, but I'm going to pig-headedly go on talking about viceroy moths. If I could take a look at the next slide, please. The cover of the magazine shows you a blue jay looking at the viceroy, which I think is on your left. I'm sorry, the monarch is on, oh, not this one, no, that one, wonderful. Shows you looking at a monarch butterfly on your left and a viceroy moth on your right. At least I hope I've got that straight. The next slide is a close-up of what I hope is a monarch butterfly. Is that right? If there's an entomologist here and I'm wrong, just correct me. And the next slide shows what I hope is the viceroy moth, which in any case is really a butterfly. Now the question that is at the heart of this whole thing is, why do they look like each other? The answer to that question has taken Lincoln Brower and his students more than 20 years to understand. And you should know this much as an opening clue in untangling this natural selection mystery. Monarch butterflies often have small bites taken out of their wings, while viceroy moths never do. Monarchs have nips out of their wing, viceroy moths do not. All right, slide 29, if we could take a look at that, shows you a blue jay devouring a monarch butterfly. The next slide shows you what happens immediately after the blue jay devours the monarch butterfly. It starts to throw up, like your freshman college student who's decided his first weekend at college that he ought to go out and get drunk. My son's an RA, a resident assistant in a dorm at Wisconsin, and he called and graphically described having to sober up a couple of his charges last weekend. So I guess some freshmen can't bear to be in college without trying it out. Now, what is going on here? Why is the blue jay throwing up? This is a very subtle chemical question. The next slide, the last one I want to show you, it's a lousy slide. I wish I were a better photographer, is the larva, the caterpillar of the monarch butterfly living on the milkweed pod. Here's a transparency of milkweed pod. We see it around here a lot. It grows here in the fall. It opens up and releases those gossamer seeds. They're really lovely to look at. I mean, every kid in the world has opened a dried milkweed pod and blown the seeds. The monarch butterfly caterpillar normally grows on the milkweed pod plant. It turns out that milkweed pod contains an extremely powerful drug which is related to digitalis, the heart medicine, and which is concentrated in the wings of the monarch butterfly when that monarch larva, that caterpillar that grew on the milkweed pod, pupates and then turns into a butterfly. We are now in a position to explain why there are bites missing from the wings of monarch butterflies, but not from the wings of viceroy moths. Any bird that takes a bite out of a monarch immediately throws up, releasing the butterfly. Any bird that bites into a viceroy finishes it, just like you would finish an ice cream cone. There are no viceroys around that have been partially nibbled by birds. And here's the point. In elaborate controlled studies which Lincoln Brower did, no blue jay that had ever bitten into a monarch butterfly and then thrown up ever again attempted to eat either a monarch butterfly or its look-alike mimic, the viceroy moth. There is, in short, intense selection among the population of viceroy moths for looking like monarch butterflies. There's a great deal more to the story than this. Monarchs raised on milkweed pods, however, do suffer from the fact that they are smaller than monarchs raised on some other plant. And furthermore, some birds, in recent studies that Brower did, have learned to break through this defense by throwing away the wings and only eating the thorax. This story, which has taken decades of work by a whole team of disciplined scientists, is only one tiny example of natural selection at work. I have just barely gotten started. I haven't even begun to describe how speciation, the formation of new species, can occur. But again, there are references in your reading list. I've not mentioned the question of dating of rocks, because we said we weren't going to debate that tonight. Let me just turn to one last question, and that has to do with the religious implications of this whole issue. And I ask your forbearance. I had specifically asked Dan to discuss this, and I'd hoped that Dr. Gish would also, and perhaps in the subsequent discussion, there'll be time for both of us to do so. In 1976, I taught a course at MSU on creation and evolution with John Moore, who was one of Dr. Gish's old friends, a founding member of the Creation Research Society. I did this because I happen to believe that the teaching of science thrives when there is controversy, provided, and this is an important note, that all people, all participants, play the game according to the rules of science, which I sketched at the beginning. For me personally, there was no religious question involved at all. In synagogue, we read the entire Pentateuch in the original aloud every year from the first verse of Genesis to the last one of Deuteronomy. We're about to complete the cycle this week. The entire normative Jewish tradition for the last 2,000 years is against a literalistic reading of Genesis. To the best of my knowledge, so is the normative Christian tradition. Historically, the sort of biblical literalism which results in creationism is a very recent phenomenon, really within just this last century. In my own tradition, famous commentators from the time of the Talmud to the present have supported the position that a literal interpretation of Genesis is not to be preferred. For example, Maimonides in the 12th century, who was well acquainted, by the way, with the Greek sources, tells us that a verse is to be understood literally only so long as it is reasonable to do so. When it is apparent that a literal interpretation would not be in accord with reason, it is legitimate and indeed necessary to interpret it metaphorically. I therefore, in going into this course, simply could not see that there could be a conflict between science and religion. And in thinking about what I was going to say to you, I remembered a quote from the Protestant theologian Paul Tillich, whom I had studied 30 years ago as an undergraduate at Northwestern. And I've taken the liberty of appending that to your reading list. For me, the straw that broke the camel's back was the creationist insistence that the earth was created recently with an appearance of age. The religious implication makes God some sort of malevolent deity playing a sort of cosmic gotcha with human beings. Well, you just thought those were fossils. I put them there just to trick you. And I just couldn't stand this. I saw kids crying because creationists were telling them that they had to choose between God and science, as if both science and religion were not manifestations of God's truth. I said earlier that science asks how questions, but never why ones. How is of great interest to me from the perspective of evolution, but totally irrelevant religiously. The really important questions, how I'm to act responsibly in a world which is full of pain and suffering, but also joy and gladness, the very questions which Ecclesiastes asks, can only be answered by religion, not by science. Forgive me if I offend some of you. Science is science, and will go on no matter how this debate comes out. None of us really gets to vote as to whether evolution or creation really explains the world. At least such a vote would not change the reality of the world in any way. But somewhere along the line, we have to face up to the pain that we cause people when we tell them that they have to make such a choice. As for me, I stand with Tillich on this issue. The truth of faith cannot be confirmed by the latest physical or biological or psychological discoveries, as it cannot be denied by them.
As you look in your program tonight, you notice we will now have a 10-minute intermission. Let me remind the ushers to be at the back doors to receive questions from the audience. You're dismissed. We will regather in about 10 minutes.
I heard about that. I bought 250 copies. I had no idea this whole thing was in such interest to anybody. If you can get one from somebody, just feel free to copy it. No, only for this reason. Under the copyright laws, it's possible for faculty to make copies of journal articles for themselves. And therefore, you made one copy for each faculty member attending. I can't send you a copy. What we hope to do is to get this thing published as a book, and at that point, you'd be able to buy it. But I just can't. I thought about bringing my own copy and I decided I didn't put it. Because that would constitute violation of copyright laws. The universe is extremely sensitive. Oh yeah, he was just professors at the College of Natural Science. I will tell you this much, that reading list includes practically every reference that was discussed at that conference. So all the stuff from 85, 6, 7 is drawn from the conference. No. John Moore? No, I had organized a conference at Michigan State last week.
Dr. Sturm, would you please come to the front, please? Dr. Sturm.
Ran all day. That was in 76. We had a whole course. We took our standard course we were both teaching on evolution, and we taught it as an evolution creation debate. I found it very challenging. Where John and I differ, and Dr. Gish knows this very well, is we disagree on what constitutes adequate evidence. So that was it was a pretty hectic course. We had a lot of fun. It's intellectually very challenging. You're putting me in a very awkward position. I'm personally very fond of John. I thought many of the scientific arguments were full of hot air. I'll tell you that flat out. I like him personally. I thought many of his arguments were fallacious. Just flatly wrong.
Audience members, if you'd please be making your way to your seats so that we might continue the debate. Please be making your way to your seats. We ought to begin in just a couple minutes. Okay, if we could come to order so that we might continue. If you are still standing, please make your way to your seat. In lieu of switching the order of the speakers for the opening statements, we will proceed in this manner for the rebuttal sessions, the rebuttal speeches. Dr. Gish will start, followed by Dr. Weinshank, and then Dr. Gish and Dr. Weinshank. The first rebuttal speeches will be 15 minutes in length. The second rebuttal speeches will be 5 minutes in length. Debaters, I will appraise you when you've reached the 5-minute mark and the 2-minute mark of your 15-minute rebuttal speech and the 2-minute mark of your 5-minute rebuttal speech. Dr. Gish, if we could have your first rebuttal, please.
Let me say, first of all, I certainly do appreciate the presentation by Dr. Weinshank. Again, I found his approach to be very congenial and with a very fine attitude, and it certainly makes things very enjoyable for all of us. Now, let me cover a few points addressed by Dr. Weinshank. He did mention the Grand Canyon. I'm very pleased that he did. Oh, by the way, I wanted to mention this. We didn't think it'd be fair to Dr. Weinshank to bring a lot of books and literature. When our institute has published between 70 and 80 books, we do publish free literature, and I didn't really feel it'd be right to make all that available unless he could bring a whole lot of stuff like that. But just let me make this announcement. We do publish free monthly publications. And if you'd like to receive this literature, learn more about our institute, we have 9 scientists on our staff, 7 of whom have their doctorates. If you want to learn more about us and the books that we have and so forth, if you give me your name and address, zip code on a piece of paper, a card or something like that, just come and drop it on the table, give it to me. I'll be very happy to add you to our mailing list. You will be sent our book list and literature free of charge. Dr. Weinshank mentioned the Grand Canyon. The Institute for Creation Research has made, we make an annual visit to the Grand Canyon, and other research projects have been carried out there by our geologists, Dr. Stephen Austin and David McQueen and others. And it's very interesting, really. There at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, they have Precambrian, no macrofossils, nothing like that. And then all of a sudden, right on top of it is the Cambrian with all of these very complex fossils. Then you go up the canyon wall, and if that's supposed to be a record of evolution, you certainly should be able to go to the canyon wall and pull out the intermediate forms. Well, of course, that can't be done. There's not a single intermediate form anywhere in the canyon wall. Now, another thing that's very interesting about the Grand Canyon, the Kaibab Plateau is the top layer. Supposedly, according to evolutionists, was uplifted 65 million years ago. Now, many theories about the canyon suggest that the Colorado River cut the canyon, or some stream like that. Totally impossible, because evolutionists have now discovered what they say is the delta of the Colorado River. They date the beginning of the delta of the Colorado River at only 5.5 million years. That's 60 million years after the Kaibab Plateau was uplifted. And if a river comes in, you see, 60 million years later, what is it going to do? It's going to run around it. It's not going to cut through that rock. Absolutely not. It takes the easiest path around, you see. There's no way possible that the Colorado River could have cut that Grand Canyon. And I was there at the museum reading their theories on how the Grand Canyon formed, and they had several geological theories, and none of them are accepted, none of them are satisfactory. Dr. Austin, our geologist, has started out with this theory some years ago, finally realized none of them would work. And they say that they don't work. And then they give the Havasupai Indian theory on how the Grand Canyon formed. They said it formed as a result of a great worldwide flood. Well, that's their theory. Now, but you don't find the record of evolution there in the Grand Canyon. On the contrary, the evidence is very contradictory to that theory. Now, Dr. Weinshank made a passing reference to the chimpanzees, and that actually they are about supposedly 1.6% difference in their genetics. There's only 1.6% difference between genetics of a chimpanzee and a human, supposedly. Now, I guarantee there's a tremendous, much greater difference in the genetics of chimpanzee and humans than that. Now, in the genes that determine our structural proteins or enzymes and things like that, it's true. There's only 1.6% different. But there's much greater difference in that between chimps and humans. Now, if you really believe that there's only that difference, that small difference, I'll believe that when you allow your daughter to date a chimpanzee. Now, I guarantee you're not going to do that. Now, furthermore, if there is only 1.6% difference, that 1.6% is extremely important. You know, a cloud is 100% water. A watermelon is 97% water. That means a cloud missed being a watermelon by only 3%. Now, well, if that's true, then that 3% is very important, isn't it? Now, evolutionists claim on the basis of biochemistry that man is more similar to a chimp and to a gorilla than he is to an orangutan, based upon the molecular homology, the molecular studies, which Dr. Michael Denton, by the way, refutes. But they claim on the basis of this molecular biology that man is closer to a chimp and a gorilla than he is to an orangutan. However, Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz, evolutionist at the University of Pittsburgh, based upon morphological characteristics, comparing of the structure of man to the orang and to the chimp and gorilla, says we are much more closely related to the orangutan than we are to the chimp or the gorilla. That means that molecular data really means nothing. As a matter of fact, none of these comparisons establish any real relationship. And I would urge you to consult the book by Dr. Charles Oxnard called The Order of Man, a fine, up-to-date chronicle of his research on these creatures, his reasons why he believes these creatures were not intermediate or ancestral to man. Now, Dr. Weinshank referred to the monarch and the viceroy butterflies. This is supposed to be an example of natural selection. Of course it's an example of natural selection. Any bird, as he said, is tried to eat a monarch butterfly, looks at the viceroy or another monarch's not going to eat it. And that's protection. But you see, that doesn't explain for an instant where the butterflies came from in the first place. That explains why the birds would not eat monarchs or viceroys. But it doesn't explain where these butterflies came from in the first place. It doesn't even try to explain that, you see. If I was going out on a battlefield and I had to face a tank, I'd much rather face a soldier with a .45 automatic than a tank. But that wouldn't explain where the tanks came from in the first place or where the soldiers came from. Furthermore, the theory is here that the viceroy, of course, started out as an ordinary butterfly and then gradually evolved to look like the monarch. I suppose that if natural selection had anything to do with it, you see. But in between, that wouldn't provide any protection whatsoever. If he's 5%, look 5% like a monarch butterfly, or 10% or 15% or 25%, that wouldn't provide any protection whatsoever. Any bird could tell the difference. Only when he exactly looks like the monarch, then the protection is afforded. How did he come that way? Well, if he just accidentally happened to turn out that way, well, that might be a good explanation. But again, it doesn't explain where butterflies came from, and that's what we have to do in origins. How did tigers come to be tigers? Not why some tigers have more spots than other tigers. How do snails come to be snails? Not because there's a difference of coloration on the snails. That doesn't give the answer at all, you see. These are the problems that have to be answered in origins and cannot be answered by this theory of gradual change and natural selection. Now, Dr. Weinshank referred to science, that we begin with observations and we construct hypotheses, then theories. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, that's not the way it's done at all. That's not the way science works. This is what Stephen Jay Gould says. He says it doesn't work that way. As a matter of fact, Darwin admitted that he started with a theory and then went looking for facts to support that theory. As a matter of fact, when Darwin published his book, it unleashed an army of scientists to go out and look for evidence to support that theory. And that's what we've had ever since. Everyone tries to force their observations to fit that theory, to vindicate this theory of evolution. That's the way science really works. You know, facts are just dumb things. They don't mean a thing until you have some interpretive framework, some theory, some way you choose to view those facts, some way you choose to interpret those facts. That's what this theory of evolution is. Now, evolutionists say we have a tentative approach. You know, we change, we can vary, and so forth. Well, in a way they do. I mean, you can challenge any mechanism of evolution, you can challenge a particular phylogeny, but I tell you one thing you must not do, and that's challenge the fact of evolution. Challenge the dogma of evolution, and you are in trouble. You are not going to get your promotion, most likely, and you're not going to get admission to a graduate program or anything like that if you express your doubts concerning the fact of evolution. That is dogma, and it is beyond challenge according to most. Evolution, not true of all, but it is certainly true of most. Now, this idea of natural selection that Dr. Weinshank mentioned, you see the idea we have these small variations, mutations and natural selection. That's the way evolution is supposed to work. That's under fierce challenge today by evolutionists themselves. Daniel Brooks and Ed Wiley, for example, have said that natural selection has really nothing to do with evolution. It preserves the species.
Under 5 minutes.
Prevents them from going downhill. But it never creates anything. It's not a creative force. Stephen Stanley of Johns Hopkins University said that natural selection is a very minor force in evolution. This idea is under attack today, and we're left really with just chance. And Richard Goldschmidt, a quarter of a century, 30 years ago, suggested the hopeful monster mechanism. Stephen Jay Gould had an article in Natural History, 1977, June issue, Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard University, in which he said we've got to go back to Goldschmidt's hopeful monster mechanism, at least some facet of him. Now, Goldschmidt, and he really did believe this, and this is what he said: the first bird hatched from a reptilian egg. That's why we have no transition form between reptiles and birds, because there never were any. The reptiles suddenly become a bird. There was a great change in the embryo that made these changes, and that's why we have all these gaps. He said we have no transition forms between phyla, classes, orders, families. These major kinds, we have no transitional forms. We can't find them because none ever existed. Well, if you can believe that, well, okay. What a tremendous shock that must have been to Mama Reptile. I think she would have given up motherhood. Papa Reptile probably would have sued her for divorce, too, claiming infidelity. But why did Goldschmidt postulate his hopeful monster mechanism? Otto Schindevel, the leading German paleontologist, also 100% supported such an idea. Why? Because they could not find those intermediate forms. If you had the intermediate forms, you never would suggest such an impossible theory that a reptile could suddenly become a bird. And so, as I've said, evolution is in tremendous turmoil today because of these troubles that evolution now are beginning to look at their theory and realize it's failing. Colin Patterson, senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, a man who'd been an evolutionist all of his life, finally began to realize he didn't know one single thing about evolution. He duped himself in all these years and believing he knew something about evolution. Said, I realized I didn't know anything.
2 minutes.
He said these hypothetical phylogenetic trees, all we have of those trees are the tips of the branches. All the rest is just storytelling of one kind or another. And he said that these ideas of how all of this evolution has occurred is nothing but empty rhetoric. I'm not saying he's come over and joined the creationists, but that is his frank assessment of the theory of evolution and the evidence for it. Now, let me close with this thought. We'll maybe come back to this. I agree with Dr. Weinshank. You do not have to choose between God and science. Not at all. Good science is good science. I'm a scientist. I made my living that way. I believe in science. What I see happening today, I believe happened yesterday and will happen in the future. But when you talk about origins, the very origin of this universe, the origin of life, and the origin of living things, you're stepping beyond the limits of empirical science. To exclude the possibility that God created these living organisms and this world and this universe, that's not abandoning science. That's accepting good science, because good science points to God, an omnipotent and omniscient creator who is responsible for the tremendous complexity, the purposefulness, and the organization that we see in this wonderful universe. And so I say, in closing, that today, as a scientist, the best statement that we can make concerning our origins is still, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Thank you.
Dr. Weinshank, your first rebuttal, please.
Well, I admire Dr. Gish. I would travel long distances to hear him because I enjoy his presentation enormously. The problem is I don't know exactly where to start. I actually brought along the 3 drums of slides of the Grand Canyon, which we use as part of a lab exercise in several courses in my department. And I could take you on a trip up and down the Grand Canyon and show you the fossils at each stage and let you draw your own conclusions. The problem with, gosh, there's no plastic to write on. Do you happen to have a sheet of plastic for this transparency? Would you be offended if I wrote on this? Just that much of it? The problem with intermediate forms was best summed up, or the problem with Dr. Gish's argument about intermediate forms, was best summed up by Randy Weissong, who, by the way, wrote a wonderful book on the creationist position. I disagree with everything in it, but it's a very well-written book. He said that the difficulty with this argument is, here you have 2 forms, and you say, where's the intermediate? So you find something like this, and you say, yes, but where's the intermediate between those 2? And so on ad infinitum. I'm not claiming that the fossil record is perfect. In fact, I referred you to a paper which very critically and very carefully tells you far more about what's wrong with the fossil record and in much greater detail than Dr. Gish has told you. I'm telling you the argument about intermediate forms is simply a specious argument given the limitations of the fossil record. I don't know how to respond to Dr. Gish's comment about the Colorado Plateau because I don't understand it, and therefore I won't. But I will say this, the genetic match between the DNA of chimps and the DNA of humans is 99.5%. There's less than 0.5% difference, and that's done by techniques that Dr. Gish, who was trained as a biochemist and got his PhD in biochemistry, as I recall, about the same time I did, maybe a few years earlier, I'm sure understands. The upshot is that he's simply wrong. Now, I hate to make such an authoritarian statement because it's no way to win friends, but he's just flatly wrong. If you do all the experiments, there is about a 0.5% difference in DNA between chimps and humans, and like it or not, we've got to live with that fact. More to the point, I guess I'm kind of troubled by an argument that appeals to your sense of things as they are, to your sense of rightness or fitness or appropriateness, to jokes about would you let your daughter date a chimp and things like that. That kind of hostile reaction to evolution has been going on since the time of Darwin. And while I'm talking about Darwin, let me also mention Dr. Gish asserted that Darwin created this theory and an army of people went out to validate it, implying some kind of, I suppose, conspiracy theory. In fact, sir, you're also completely wrong about that as well. We have a very clear notion of how Darwin created his theory, and it is precisely in the way I presented to you. I've been referring you to a lot of books on the reading list. I apologize for only bringing 250 copies. I had no idea this topic was of much interest other than me and Dwayne Gish. I would have brought 500 if I'd known all you people were going to show up, but please be helpful and share your copy with somebody else and make another copy. Anyway, in that list, I've also referenced a book by my colleague Paul Barrett and 4 other people that was just published by the British Museum, which is the critical edition of Darwin's early notebooks. Darwin kept lots of notebooks, and he jotted down thoughts about metaphysical ideas and ideas about evolution and little memoranda, things he wanted to look up. We have an extraordinarily clear idea of how he went about formulating the theory, and indeed he worked on it for 20 years until Wallace, Alfred Russel Wallace, happened to send him an essay that essentially paralleled his early sketch. And with extreme pressure from some of his friends, he was urged into writing what we now call The Origin of Species. He might have tinkered around with it for another 20 years. In short, the process of developing theories inductively, as I have represented it to you, is precisely the process that Darwin went through. Dr. Gish is correct in saying that I haven't talked about where butterflies come from. That would require that you bring in somebody of far greater competence than I am in terms of the paleontological record. In fact, what I most object to about the presentation of the creationists is the fact that they appeal to either, one, the lack of information, and the lack of information proves nothing except that we don't know things, which I said is a perfectly good scientific position, and two, that they talk about animal and plant life in an overly simplistic way, which does not, in my judgment, reflect the full complexity of it. If you talk to a paleontologist about the evolution of anything, the horses, for instance, you'll accept the horses as an example. Dr. Gish would say they're all horses. There are, I don't even remember, I have a colleague who's a vertebrate paleontologist and filled me in at one point, I think 27 different things between Eohippus and the modern horse Equus. Eohippus was something that was about the size of a collie and ran on 3 or 4 toes, if memory serves me correctly, and a real horse is a lot taller than I am. So there are 27 different things branching in all sorts of different directions. Dr. Gish would call this, and every other case where he describes classes of plants or animals, as being invariant and unchanged. He would say cats are always cats and dogs are always dogs, and I presume horses are always horses. In fact, that early thing, Eohippus, was classified originally as not being a horse at all, but as being a member of a whole extinct group, and on and on. What I'm saying to you is that a creationist can come to you tonight and appeal to what you know about the details of science and, forgive me, mislead you. And indeed, he could do the same thing to me, because I don't really know beans about paleontology. I was trained as a biochemist, and I'm now in computer science. And what I know about paleontology is what little I've had to pick up to give one lecture in the course I teach. He could not fool a paleontologist. And in fact, the real test of whether creation is a science is this: do creationists, like other scientists, publish in refereed journals, in journals that are refereed by scientists? By the way, refereeing is done by blind review. You send an article to the editor removes the cover page, which contains your name, and sends it to 3 prominent people in the field for review and asks whether or not the paper should be published, and if so, should it be modified in any way. Creationists only publish for each other. They don't publish in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. They don't publish in annual reviews. They just don't publish in scientific journals. And the reason is because they don't go in for doing science at the same level of detail that real scientists do. And for that, I really do fault the creationists. And my argument about, I don't know beans about the evolution of butterflies, bring in somebody who does. But I suspect somebody who's an expert in the history of insects could bore you for an entire evening with pictures of a wide variety of fossil specimens of insects just to get at that one issue. Well, I don't know where to turn next. Let's try Goldschmidt, the hopeful monster theory. It's funny that Dr. Gish mentioned the hopeful monsters theory, because one of the speakers at last Thursday's symposium took this up. In fact, a careful reading of Goldschmidt, the hopeful monster was more or less what Dr. Gish said. A careful reading of Goldschmidt, however, shows that what he was talking about is something that we understand very well today indeed, and it's rearrangement of chromosomes. And for reasons that you know if you've taken a first course in genetics, there are some genes that control other genes. If you split up and rearrange the chromosomes on which those genes occur, all sorts of strange and fascinating things happen. It is in that sense that Gould, I think, is talking about the fact that perhaps we ought to re-examine Goldschmidt. He asserts that evolution is in turmoil and quotes Patterson from the British Museum. I confess I've not read Patterson from the British Museum. But he does not tell you about the hundreds of very critical studies of natural selection which are going on today in a wide variety of plants and animals and being published in refereed journals. He tells you that when we talk about origins, I'm not talking about the origin of life, but just where did cats and dogs and people and dandelions come from, that we're stepping beyond the limits of empirical science. I think he's wrong. I think what we're doing is playing detective. If you don't believe that it's possible to reconstruct the past on the basis of evidence that you find in the present, then I suggest you go down to Jackson and turn all those people free. They're all there because somebody has, in the role of detective, reconstructed a crime that they have committed in sufficient detail to persuade a jury of 12 good men and women that they ought to be incarcerated. That's what an evolutionist does. An evolutionist puts together the evidence, demands that the evidence be consistent, demands that the subject matters that we deal with be complete. We can't ignore any facts that are known. In fact, one of the ways to get murdered in a scientific journal is to publish an article in which you fail to reference some key articles that have been published in the area and deal with some key facts.